So good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Shahana Parveen and my colleagues from Bangladesh for their very kind invitation to participate in this excellent meeting. I enjoyed listening to Dr. Neerja Bhatla as always, and I see many friends. Dr. Coleman is there. Good evening or good morning, Dr. Coleman. My remit in the next about 20 or 25 minutes is to talk about the management of cervix cancer, recent advances and applicability in diverse settings. So those are my disclosures. This was a patient that we treated about 10 years ago. She was a 49-year-old woman, no comorbidities except a prior history of tuberculosis. She was diagnosed with cancer of the cervix 2B, then 2B. And this is the exact diagram from how we staged her clinically at that point of time. She had a high-grade squamous carcinoma. At that point of time, we were running our neoadjuvant trial. And so she received 3 cycles of paclitaxel and carboplatin, after which she underwent radical hysterectomy. She had a poorly differentiated squamous carcinoma in the surgical specimen with an ulcerated lesion measuring 1.5 centimeters, and all the nodes were negative. But 15 months later, as you can see here, she developed lung metastasis. And the reason I started with the case was to illustrate the fact that despite initial success, many patients continue to relapse and eventually die of their disease. This is some recent data from our hospital-based cancer registry at Tata Memorial Center, and I apologize for the poor reproduction here. I just had my PA scan this today. So the point that I wish to make is this is data from 2018, just published in September 2021, and you can see that close to about 60 or 65% of the patients, even in Tata Memorial Center in Mumbai, continue to have relatively advanced stage cervix cancer at the time of their presentation. And only a small minority receive single modality treatment, and the majority require some kind of combination treatment because of the advanced stage cancer. So thankfully, cervix cancer is declining in incidence in most parts of the world, including in the underprivileged parts of the world, in rural areas and urban areas. There are a few outliers, but for the most part, the incidence has been declining steadily over the past many decades. And I don't propose to go into the reasons why this is so, but this is the fact. However, many parts of the world continue to have high incidence and relatively high mortality from this disease. And you can see here that cervix cancer continues to be either the #1 or the #2 cancer in terms of incidence as well as mortality in many parts of the world, including in India and Bangladesh. Unfortunately, it is also these parts of the world that are deficient in resources that are needed to treat cervix cancer. And I have highlighted or circled the parts of the world that have either no radiotherapy equipment or less than 1 per million population, which is definitely inadequate to treat not only cervix, but other cancers as well. So I don't plan to bamboozle you with complicated description of the genomic characterization of cervix cancer, except to point out that many advances have been made. We have gained insight into the molecular structure of this tumor as well as other tumors. This is the TCGA report published a few years ago, and it shows that cervix cancer does have a few perhaps driver mutations, and the genomic makeup of different subtypes or different histopathological subtypes of cervix cancer is perhaps different. There are several issues in the contemporary management of cervix cancer: staging, surgery, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, new treatments, and treatment of recurrent or persistent disease. And I will discuss them in turn. I don't propose to go into the details of the staging because Dr. Neerja Bhatla has covered that very well, and I enjoyed her talk. I will just share with you as a clinician, what I think are the implications of the revised FIGO staging for many of us. So we know that there is a size characterization or a sub-classification within stage 1B with the cutoff of 2 centimeters. And I think this is useful because it does divide patients into those who might be eligible for fertility sparing surgery, as well as, with some caveats, some of those who might also be eligible for minimally invasive surgery. As she correctly pointed out, lymph nodes have been incorporated. The implication is that some patients with otherwise operable disease who now are found to have lymph node metastasis will be treated with concurrent chemoradiation and not with surgery. But the more important implication is the fact that now there is more work for both radiologists as well as pathologists. And until now, I think everybody hid under the excuse that cervix cancer is primarily a clinically staged disease, so let's not pay too much attention to radiological characterization. But that has changed, should change, and is changing. So we expect more precise characterization of both the primary tumor as well as the metastatic sites, including lymph node stations, from the radiologists. I think Dr. Batla very nicely discussed the pros and cons of the various radiological techniques. MRI is good for pelvic evaluation. PET-CT is somewhat reasonable for lymph node metastasis and for distant metastasis. And our working group at Tata Memorial Center, this is just a suggestion. There are several other variations of this that are possible. In early stage disease, perhaps an MRI pelvis with screening of the abdomen. In locally advanced disease, a PET-CT plus a contrast-enhanced CT, or perhaps a PET-CT plus an MRI of the pelvis. But let me say, because my topic was also to talk about the feasibility, and I think there is a lack of widespread feasibility in many parts of the world where cervix cancer is common. And I believe the next item on the agenda today is to discuss the applicability of many of these diagnostic techniques and treatments in resource constrained settings. So this is something for consideration. Pathologists also have more work because now lymph nodes have become important, because I think Dr. Amita Maheshwari will talk about the treatment of lymph nodes in cervix cancer later down the line. So we are beginning to see the use of sentinel lymph node, including in some centers with ultra staging and the use of immunohistochemistry on lymph nodes. Again, it is my impression that there is a lack of widespread feasibility of all of these techniques in many parts of the world, where on the map of the world I showed you, cervix cancer is common. There are implications for epidemiologists. I have still not understood how cervix cancer patients who are staged by different methodologies in different regions will then begin to be combined together in metadata, and how will they be analyzed? Because one person's stage 1B will be another person's stage 3. And so I'm sure there are smart people who propose to do this, but I have still not understood how this will be possible in the future. Let me talk about surgery. The most important question, the most important trial in the past few years has been the one that compared minimally invasive surgery or open surgery for cervix cancer. I don't propose to discuss this trial in any great detail because all of you know about it. I think it has been discussed perhaps 10,000 times. Just for the sake of completion and for rounding off my talk, this was a randomized trial that compared the performance of open radical hysterectomy with minimally invasive radical hysterectomy in patients with early stage operable cervix cancer, the previous stage 1A and 1B1, and for disease-free survival, overall survival, as well as for locoregional recurrence. There was a significant detriment with the use of minimally invasive surgery. This study has basically shown us that there is no substantial difference in quality of life, and minimally invasive surgery is often touted for its benefits in terms of quality of life of patients or short-term morbidity. But there was no difference in quality, or at least no substantial difference in quality of life, no difference in intraoperative complications, and nearly 4 times more recurrences and 6 times more deaths in the arm or in the group of patients who received MIS. This data has been more or less confirmed by several registry and cohort type studies. This is data from US. This is data from Canada. This is data from UK. And this is the data from Europe. And all of them essentially in aggregate suggest that there is a detriment of minimally invasive surgery in the treatment of early stage cervix cancer. So I think the gynecological surgeons among you can discuss as to why this should be so when several other cancers have not shown such stark results. But there is the fact that minimally invasive surgery is not the done thing in early cervix cancer. So at least for this particular advance, I must say that open surgery is the more feasible option in low and middle income countries, and it should now not only be done, but it should be the standard practice all over the world, including in our part of the world. Let me talk about the management of locally advanced disease. We know that concomitant cisplatin-based chemotherapy and radiotherapy has been the standard treatment for more than 20 years now. There is a meaningful and substantial gain. This is a meta-analysis that was reported several years after the initial trials with the use of concurrent radiotherapy in these patients. There continued to be a little bit of doubt about the benefit in the most advanced stages 3 and 4. This was a study from the gynec group of our hospital. And these are all patients with stage 3B squamous carcinoma of the cervix, about 850 of them, who were randomized to either concurrent chemoradiation or radiotherapy alone. And you can see that there is a substantial benefit in this group of patients. And therefore, I think at the current time, there is no doubt that all patients or almost all patients should receive concurrent chemoradiotherapy with a platinum regimen. There have been several attempts at trying to improve the outcome in this group of patients. I have not seen any substantial advances. This is one study that did report an advance. So this was a study reported by a Mexican group comparing cisplatin alone as concomitant chemoradiation with gemcitabine plus cisplatin given during radiotherapy and 2 cycles after radiotherapy. And the study actually showed that both the progression-free and overall survival were improved with gemcitabine plus cisplatin compared with cisplatin alone. But the rate of toxicity was substantially higher. If you look at grade 3 to 4 neutropenia, it is 51% versus 6%. So both hematological and non-hematological toxicities were substantially higher in the group that received gemcitabine cisplatin. And even with that increased toxicity, I have never completely understood, but the fact is that this regimen has never become the standard treatment in this disease. Perhaps the results needed to be replicated in other studies, which was never done. But the fact is that only cisplatin continues, weekly cisplatin continues to be the standard treatment in this scenario. As far as adjuvant treatment is concerned, we saw the presentation of the Outback trial in ASCO 2021. These were patients, again, mostly with locally advanced cervix cancer who were randomized to either receive or not receive 4 cycles of paclitaxel and carboplatin after completion of concurrent chemoradiation. The primary endpoint was overall survival, and you can see that there was no meaningful or statistically significant benefit of using adjuvant chemotherapy with paclitaxel and carboplatin in these patients. The other treatment that has been considered is neoadjuvant chemotherapy followed by surgery. And for a long time, this seemed to be a promising treatment. It was, I think, for the most part, never used in a widespread manner in many parts of the world. But in Europe, in Asia, in East Asia, neoadjuvant chemotherapy and surgery has been routinely practiced in many centers and in many regions. There was no definitive comparison with concurrent chemoradiation. Our group at Tata Memorial Center reported this randomized study in the JCO a few years ago, following its presentation at ESMO in 2017. Again, about 635 patients who were randomized to all patients with squamous carcinoma, stage 1B, 2, 2A or 2B, randomized to receive either 3 cycles of neoadjuvant chemotherapy, paclitaxel and carboplatin in standard doses, followed by radical hysterectomy or standard concurrent chemoradiation. There was a planned crossover from neoadjuvant surgery to CTRT in case of lack of response or intraoperative unresectability. And you can see that patients also received post-operative either adjuvant radiotherapy or concurrent chemoradiotherapy based on the standard criteria. About 57% of patients in this study had stage 2B disease. Eventually, in the surgical arm, I have just circled this here, almost 44% of patients ended up receiving radiotherapy for one reason or the other. The toxicities were more or less comparable between the two arms, except for some excess in hematological toxicity in the neoadjuvant arm and an excess of GI toxicity in the CTRT arm, as well as some excess in kidney toxicity and skin toxicity in the concurrent chemoradiation arm. In terms of long-term toxicity, and not very surprisingly, there was a higher incidence of vaginal toxicity in the group that received concurrent chemoradiation. The primary endpoint of the study was disease-free survival, and you can see that there was a substantial benefit of using CTRT compared with neoadjuvant chemotherapy and surgery. In terms of overall survival, there was no significant difference between the two arms. In a subgroup analysis, the benefit of CTRT seemed to be largely confined to patients with stage 2B disease. And you can see that patients with stage 1B, 2 and 2A, and I must remind you that this is the previous staging, not the current staging, the outcomes seemed to be similar. There was a very similar study reported from the EORTC in ASCO in 2019, and this study was very, very similar with two main differences. The first being the use of cisplatin-based chemotherapy in the neoadjuvant setting instead of carboplatin, and the second being that overall survival was the primary endpoint of this study. And very interestingly, an exact 57% of patients in this trial also had stage 2B disease. And you can see that for overall survival, there was no significant difference between the arms, although there was a 4% benefit of CTRT, which was numerically better, but not statistically better. But for disease-free survival, there was a 9% improvement with concurrent chemoradiation, which was also statistically significant. There could be several explanations for the outcome detriment with neoadjuvant chemotherapy. Perhaps we delay radiotherapy in a substantial proportion of patients with who are randomized to the neoadjuvant chemotherapy arm, and perhaps chemotherapy is not as effective in cervix cancer as we believed it would be. Anyways, there are a couple of other studies. This is a phase 2 study, a randomized study that tested neoadjuvant gemcitabine and cisplatin prior to concurrent chemoradiation, again showing a detriment with neoadjuvant chemotherapy. And I think in terms of its feasibility, perhaps neoadjuvant chemotherapy is feasible in many regions of low and middle income countries. But at least I believe our group in Tata Memorial believes that it should not be routinely practiced because of inferior outcomes. And moreover, it is also my impression that good quality radical hysterectomy is also not widely available in many of these parts of the world. So radiotherapy, there have been several advances. I don't propose to go into the details. I believe Dr. Supriya Chopra is talking about brachytherapy later on in this session. The EMBRACE group has led the advancements in radiotherapy in cervix cancer, dose escalation using more sophisticated and more targeted forms of radiotherapy to the tumor volume. This was a study that was led by her, Supriya Chopra, from Tata Memorial Center, and I asked her. She's not covering this study, so therefore I think I plan to briefly discuss this in my talk. This was a comparison of image-guided intensity modulated radiotherapy compared with 3D conformal radiotherapy, which is the conventional way of giving radiation when used in the post-operative adjuvant setting in cervix cancer. These were patients who had undergone a hysterectomy for cervix cancer and required adjuvant radiotherapy. They were randomized either to 3D CRT or to IMRT. The primary endpoint was late GI toxicity as determined by physicians according to the CTCAE grading. And the secondary endpoint was quality of life as reported by patients. And you can see that for the primary endpoint of late GI toxicity as well as late NE toxicity, there was a marked benefit of using radiotherapy with IMRT compared with 3D CRT. And I think most radiation oncologists will tell us that IMRT is perhaps the better way to give radiotherapy. It reduces complications. But again, I will put it to the next panel as to how feasible it is to give IMRT in many parts of the world where advanced cancer is common or patients requiring adjuvant radiotherapy are common. This is not only in terms of equipment, but also the physics and planning expertise that is required to pull off these sophisticated planning treatments. How can we better target cervix cancer? Angiogenesis, we know that angiogenesis, there is high level of neoangiogenesis in patients who have cervix tumors. This was the GOG 240. And again, this tested in patients with recurrent or metastatic CA cervix, the use of bevacizumab or not in addition to chemotherapy. And for the main outcome of overall survival, there was some benefit, a modest benefit in terms of overall survival, which was statistically significant. And when this was analyzed by subgroups according to the Moore's criteria, you can see that most of the benefit was confined to patients with mid and high risk groups, and the low risk group actually did not benefit substantially from bevacizumab. In India and in other parts of the world, there are now biosimilars of bevacizumab. So perhaps we can have some possible feasibility of using bevacizumab in some of these patients currently and in the years to come. There is a rationale of immune therapy in cervix cancer, and I will not go into the biological rationale. Let me say that there have been recent advancements, especially in the metastatic setting. It started with this study called a basket study called the Keynote 158. This was a phase 2 study that included many cancer types, including cervix cancer. And these were patients who had already received at least one line of treatment in the advanced setting. The overall response rate was about 12% in the entire cohort, and in those who were PD-L1 positive, it was about 14.5%. So based on these data, the US FDA approved the use of pembrolizumab with the use of PD-L1 as determined by the DACO antibody as a companion diagnostic. More recently, a few months ago at ESMO and in NEJM, we had the presentation of this important study, the Keynote 826. And these were patients who were first-line metastatic or recurrent and who had not received treatment for advanced stage disease. They were randomized to receive pembrolizumab or placebo in addition to chemotherapy. And the primary endpoint, the co-primary endpoints were overall survival and progression-free survival. About 89% of patients had a PD-L1 positive tumors, the combined positive score of more than or equal to 1. And about 30% of patients had de novo metastatic disease. Both for PFS and for OS, there was a substantial and statistically significant improvement in terms of both of those endpoints. The only subgroup that did not seem to benefit from pembrolizumab, and this is a subgroup analysis of both PFS and OS, were patients whose tumors had a PD-L1 of less than 1 by the CPS score. Not surprisingly, there was some excess of serious toxicities in the group that received pembrolizumab, mainly immune-related adverse events. And thankfully, this is one study that showed that the quality of life was also improved in the group of patients that received the immune checkpoint inhibitor. There are other studies that are ongoing at this setting. My take on the immune checkpoint inhibitor results in cervix cancer is as follows. I think there's a meaningful improvement in survival and quality of life in the first line setting. It is possible and likely that we will also observe a benefit of immune checkpoint inhibitors in patients with locally advanced disease. But again, I will put it to you, at the current cost and the regimen 35 cycles or until disease progression, this is most certainly not going to be feasible in most parts of the world where people actually require this treatment. So this is my last slide. I think there has been substantial progress in the management of cervix cancer, especially in the past few years. The feasibility of some of the new treatment approaches is questionable, and we have to see how we can also make treatments that are effective also accessible. And once again, I thank you very much for your attention.